Welcome to Engage, featuring speaker Tolu Odulesi, software program manager at Google and beloved child of God. Sponsored by Connect Silicon Valley, formerly known as the Silicon Valley Prayer Breakfast.
Thank you. Oh, wow, it's a lot of people. Well, good morning. Good morning. Hope you guys are having a good breakfast, and thank you. Thank you for having me. So let me start out by saying thank you for the gift of your listening and just for the time that we're going to spend together today. I want to start out by saying one of the more important things we have to learn in this journey of life is unlearning some of the truths we've come to accept, right? And I suspect what I'm going to talk about today, they're things you already know about. They're things you wrestle with. And so my aim today is to sort of bubble up the issue of identity again, and maybe have you look at it from a different perspective, right? That's really my goal today, and I'm trusting that today we'll have a wonderful time and have a good discussion afterwards. So let me tell you a little bit about my story. So I grew up in Nigeria. I'm the last of 10, big family. And growing up in Nigeria, one of the banners of our home was academic excellence. So it became very important for you to do well in academics, to be educated. Now, I suspect that was so because my dad and my mom grew up in an era where the opportunities you got if you were educated were just vastly and dramatically more so than what you would get if you were not educated. So for me, academic excellence and later on excellence became my identity in a sense. Slowly but surely, I started feeding more and more into that, into just doing well, right? Doing really well, being the best I can be. And so that became my identity, and you see that even as we go on further. So, like I said, like Mike said, I've been in the Valley for a number of years. I worked at Apple for about 4+ years, and I work at Google now as a senior program manager, where I get to work with some really cool people. And I'm usually the least smartest person in the room, but it's humbling but fun, a lot of good fun. And so because my background being in academic excellence, my identity tied to that, it becomes very easy for me to tie my identity to productivity at work, to tie my identity to the value I bring and what I do. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the issue of identity. We'll look at it from different ways, how we define ourselves, and how we can sort of swim upstream against some of those false identities we usually have. Before we go into that, though, I do want to say that identity is for everyday life. It's not simply for those seeking self-fulfillment. Because in a sense, when I say identity, I mean the core of who you are, how you process things. And so we are all theologians in a certain way. What I mean by that is we all have a mental model through which we process the world. We process how we relate to people. And that ultimately ties back to the issue of identity, right? And how we define ourselves. And so that's what we'll sort of focus on more today. So what is identity? Identity, I'm not going to define it. I'm sure you all have definitions of that. But identity is that word that we all know what it is, but sometimes it can be hard to nail down. And when I say identity, for the purpose of the conversation, what I mean is the core of who you are, right? It's the answer to the question, who are you, or who are you becoming, right? It's not your name, it's not your family, it's not what you do. So when I say identity, I want you to be thinking about the underpinnings of who you are, the motivations, right, your value system. And the best way to look at identity might be to look at the patterns of your life. And when I say that, I'm talking about your decisions, I'm talking about your actions, your community, your value systems. If you look at the pattern of your life and you look at that over a period of time, and maybe even look at that in unguarded moments, I think then you would maybe begin to get a better sense of what your identity might be, right? That would be some, indications of what our identity might be. So like I said, that's what I'm going to touch on today. So going back to my story, academic excellence being the banner of our home. Thankfully, you could say, I had an aptitude for that. And so it became very easy for me to feed into that. When I did great in school, my dad will praise me, my mom will praise me, everything will be great. And so I sort of figured things out. I'm like, if I do great, I get gifts, I can get away with bad habits, everything is going well, right? And so But slowly but surely, I was feeding into that. Right? I was being formed by that. There were accolades, prizes at school, and so there was also a subtle pride that came with that I didn't know at that point, but I was just feeding into it. If you wonder how I got here from Nigeria, a lot of it had to do with academics, right? Got a scholarship, came to the United States, did my SATs, passed, just did great, right? And so again, identity being formed around excellence in general. One thing I want to say about identity though, even though I've talked about my identity being formed around excellence, is that identity is complex and fluid. It's not usually just one thing. It's a mashup of a combination of things, right? And I talk about it being fluid and complex because we are always being formed, right? Whether we partake of that actively or not, we are all becoming a certain type of person, right? Day on to day, we are becoming a certain type of person. So there's always formation that is ongoing. And I say that because as we continue with this conversation, I want you to be reflecting on your identity, on who you are, on how your identity stands up to different situations and what that means. And again, we'll touch a little bit on that. So again, just to summarize, identity is complex. We are always being formed. We are always becoming a certain type of person. A little bit of my story, I was becoming that kid that relied on his intellectual prowess. That was my ticket to things. The fact that I got to the US actually cemented that more because I could look at myself and say, oh, look, diligence, rigor, study, discipline, and you can go places, right? And that was what I was being formed on. That was what my identity was being formed on. I do want to say, though, it wasn't that my parents were driving me that way. It was just something I picked up on, and I continued with it, and I drove with it, right? And so that was how my identity was being formed. One of the things I want to talk about is what are the common ways in which we define ourselves? Right, I want to segue into that, and I want to start off by asking you a question. What is your identity, or how do you define yourself? Now, I don't want you to quickly answer that, or give an answer in your mind. What I want you to do again is to, just reflect back over periods of time in your life, and looking at the pattern of your life, looking at what motivates you, your value systems in general, looking at both the small decisions and the big decisions, to think about your identity, to think about how you're being formed. So I'm going to speak about 3 quick ways in which we define ourselves. They're more general ways. I'm sure there are others. And I would just invite you to be thinking about that. The first way in which we define ourselves is that I am what I have, or I am what I possess, right? This is usually anchored in that thirst for, it could be a thirst for recognition, it could be a thirst for success, for wealth, for comfort. And sometimes it's driven by the fear of not being enough. And so there's that striving to get more and get more just for the sake of getting more, right? And so the identity around I am what I have or what I possess, regardless of your status or where you might be, right? Regardless of the economic status or whatnot, it's an identity that drives you into the ground, because it doesn't really provide any long-lasting satisfaction at the end of the day. So that's one way in which we define ourselves. And part of what I want you to be thinking about is what happens when what I have is not enough, or what happens when what I have goes away. And when I say goes away, what I mean is at some point it's just not as significant anymore, right? No matter what it is I've built my life on in terms of what I have. And of course, going back to what Mike spoke about, in the face of death, the great leveler, right? You have to think about, how does my identity stack up? Because it's something eventually we will all face, right? And so the first way of defining ourselves generally is I am what I have, or I am what I possess. The second way I would say is I am what people say about me. And this is anchored in this fear of rejection, or this longing for acknowledgement, this wanting to be known. This particularly I find a terrible burden, right? Because you want to be spoken well of in terms of your reputation, right? And you strive to be the best. And even when you're the best, the moment you hear someone else is better, there's already something else going on inside of you, like, ugh. And you just, sometimes you don't even know it's ongoing because it's subconscious. A lot of what we say is our identity. Like if you asked me back when I was in Nigeria, Tolu, what's your identity? I'll tell you, oh, no, I'm a Christian. That's my identity. Right? And I believed that. It wasn't that I was lying. I truly believed that. But what was truly driving me was excellence. Even in the place of spirituality, it was in a sense, how many Bible passages could I memorize? Right? What could I speak to? What do I know? I know all those stories. Yes, I know about that story. Right? And those things in a very subtle, subconscious way what was forming me. So going back to the way in which we define ourselves in terms of, I am what people say about me. I think as a society, we care too much about what people say about us, right? I think the advent of social media has just pushed that to unimaginable levels, right? Where we are so concerned with the praise of men. And it is a terrible burden, right? It colors everything you do. There is no authenticity to that. And again, you already know that this is like a rat race, right? It's like adventures are missing the point, honestly. And so that's another way in which we define ourselves. I am what people say about me. The last one I want to talk about is I am what I do. And this is where my workplace comes into play, right? Because it is anchored in the thirst for significance. Like I want my life to matter. And so my identity becomes wrapped around what I do, right? And this doesn't matter whether you're in the corporate world or you're doing mission trips, right? Your identity can easily be wrapped around what you do, what you believe gives you significance, right? And that was also the case for me, which we'll see in a little bit. And again, these are all burdens that really don't help. Because no matter what you do, at some point someone is going to be better. Or at some point you're not going to be able to do that thing again. And so what happens? Right? And again, it could be whether you're in the corporate world or you're in ministry. It doesn't really matter. It's wrapping your identity around what you do. So now, having said all of that, you might ask me the question, how do you push against this? How do you fight against this? For me, it came through several painful brushes with reality for the structures of my identity, my former identity, to start cracking. So like you said, academic excellence, productivity, rigor, discipline, that was my identity. That was how I defined myself. And so like I said, that brought me into the US in a way, you could say, in terms of studying and doing very well in academics and getting a scholarship to come here from Nigeria. So did my undergraduate in computer science, graduated as valedictorian. Maybe the first indication of my identity came while I was given the valedictory speech. I gave that speech, everybody clapped, but I was empty. I was just in a daze. I just kept asking myself, this is it? This is why I was studying so much in the night? Okay, I've given the speech, that's it? Right? And people were congratulating me, but my eyes were just kind of glazed over. And I was just it was almost like I was stepping out of myself and just looking around. So that was my first brush, in a sense, with that identity. I moved on to work at Motorola. Did well there, did a master's in software engineering, graduated with a 4.0 GPA. I didn't even go for the graduation. I'm just like, whatever. Went to get, you could see how my identity was. Went to get a master's in, an MBA, down in Florida, graduated as a valedictorian as well, 4.0 GPA. Got a number of awards on that day. And that would be my second brush with reality, in a sense. Because it was a small school, a private college, Rollins College down in Florida. And a lot of parents wanted to talk to me and meet me. And they would meet me, talk, chit chat. And the next question they would ask is, okay, so where are you going to be working? The problem was I didn't have a job. And that was that was in 2010. So the recession, I believe, that bottomed out, but things weren't taking up really. So I didn't have a job. And to give that answer over and over and over again, I was just like, oh, I don't have a job. I don't have a job. I don't have a job. And so by the end of the day, I was tired. I was just tired. I'm just like, what is this? What is going on? Why isn't things working out for me? The funny thing was a lot of my classmates would call me to do like mock interviews for them. And I would do that. And they would get the job, but I just couldn't get a job. I just couldn't get a job. And for the next 5 months, it would be like that. And that was when the structures of my identity started crumbling. Because I had to look at myself and say, okay, so what does my life mean? Now, during that time, I had a part-time job on campus where I was working 10 hours a week. And the money I was making wasn't even enough to pay half of my rent. And I was in Florida. Florida is cheap. so you get a sense of where I was at. I'm like, I have 3 degrees and I've graduated 4.0 GPAs. I'm like, what am I doing? Like, why is my life this way? So I was working on campus, like I said. I was working for the marketing department, helping them with some web analytics and tracking some data and things like that. And there was a lake by the campus that I would walk on during lunch. And I would just take walks. And sometimes I would just break down crying. Like, what is going on with me? Why is my life turning this way? And this also started cracking my identity in God in a sense. Let me explain what I mean. So part of my formation based on excellence and rigor was that what it meant to be a great Christian was that I read my Bible, I quote scripture, I go to church and I check certain boxes. And so I had to confront that too. I'm like, God, I've been following you, like what's going on in my life? And so those things started cracking my identity. Those were mercies in disguise for me, right? Because it made me confront what I'd built my life on. I didn't have answers, but I knew the way I was defining myself was wrong, right? And that would be probably the most significant one. There are other stories, but at that point, that was the most significant turning point for me. And so the next question you might ask is, so how did you navigate around that? And for me, navigating around that, again, will come in the place of God locating me in the midst of a community of believers. And the interesting thing was, it was very, I guess you would say subtle, maybe unconscious. What I started noticing as I interacted with them was that they had a way of engaging success and failures that I wasn't used to. For me, when I was successful, it was something to celebrate. When I failed, it was something to sort of hide, right? Not let anybody know. But there was a humility and an openness with which they handled success, and more importantly, failure, right? I saw in their lives that they were truly reliant on God. I saw in their lives that they could handle failures and not be undone. They could handle not getting to their goals, and it wasn't the end of life. They valued other things like relationships with their family more. They valued relationship with God more. And for me, it became a turning point. And that was a significant way for me to start looking at my identity and what that means, right? And so going back to that question, how then did I start defining myself? At that point, I realized that I had to find something else to base my identity on, and it had to be outside of me. It wasn't enough that I would define myself by my strength, basically, by the sweat of my brow or the strength of my back. I had to find something else, and it had to be outside of me. It also had to be something that could sustain different circumstances or situations. It had to go beyond that. And so looking at just how God in mercy had brought me through some painful reality and interactions and the community of believers, what I came to see was that I had to swim upstream against how I was defining myself, right? I understood and I saw that society sort of feeds into those 3 ways we define ourselves, right? I'm what I have, I'm what I possess, right? And for me, what I have I had intellectual prowess and capacity, right? And what people say about me. For me, in attaining those achievements and whatnot, it brought about the praise of men, and I was feeding on that, right? And when it comes to I am what I do, well, I didn't have a job for 5 months. It was painfully clear to me that I was defining myself by what I did in terms of significance, right? And so through a process that I would spare you, I've come to see myself now as a beloved child of God. That is how I define myself now. That is what gives me value now. I see that the love of God, supremely shown on the cross of Christ, as the basis, as the answer to the fear that was really driving me to define myself by what I have and what I possess, by what people are saying about me, and by what I was doing, right? The significance of what I was doing. So that being said, I want to leave you with sort of 2 areas that I think in general we all have to confront when it comes to identity. The first one is success and failures, right? And the question I have there is, how does your identity stack up with that, right? And for me, that was one of the first things I had to look at in terms of, if I'm going to define myself a different way, I have to look at the areas of success and failure. Now, I must say, though, that for me, it wasn't very, the way I'm talking, you might think, oh, I sat down and I'm like, oh, how do I define myself? It wasn't like that. It was a process of reflection, which is one of the things I would encourage you to get into more, just reflecting on life. Mike talked about how we identify ourselves with different periods of life. I had to do that and just go back and reflect and think about my values and what was motivating me, my actions, right, and seeing the pattern there. So going back to the idea of success and failures, like, we're in Silicon Valley. That's how you're measured, generally, right? What you bring to the table, what your value is. We're the epicenter of productivity, innovation, whatever you want to call it. And so the question is, how does your identity, how does my identity stack up against success and failures? How do I handle those things? And I'm not just talking about success and failure in some kind of, metaphysical way, but I'm thinking, let's say, for example, I want to buy a house, right? And I want to have a family, I want to buy a house. Well, I need more money to that. I'm trying to get a promotion. Well, what if I don't get that promotion? Like, and then what happens? How do I deal with that, right? And the answer for me lies in who I am becoming, right? I mentioned a couple moments back that formation is always ongoing. We are all becoming a certain type of person. Nobody is static. You are all becoming a certain type of person. And for me, in anchoring my identity on God, I was becoming the type of person that, yes, I have goals and things I want to accomplish, but if I don't, first of all, it's not the end of the world. Second of all, I had to reevaluate why I wanted to accomplish those things and what was behind it, right? And so for me, the idea of who I am becoming becomes important in facing success and failures. Sometimes what I actually see is the failures or the things I don't achieve, they're actually the best thing that never happened to me. Because I look at it, I'm like, I don't really want to be that person. Like, you don't have a life. Like, I understand you get a lot of accolades and whatnot, but I don't want that. It's okay, right? Like, I can see how that goes. I can see what I need to do to get there, but I don't really want to get there. So in a sense, I am becoming, and it's a journey, it's a struggle. This isn't something you just decide one day and you get, right? It's a struggle, and we definitely need God's help. But part of what I'm saying is, I actually don't want to be, I might mix up the phrase, I don't want to be the master of my faith, right? I don't want to be the captain of my soul. And I say that because I'm a finite human being. I have myopic views of myself, of people around me, of what's good, of what's not good. Like, I can't even see 5 minutes into the future. I don't want to be the master of my faith, right? That's one way, that's one area where our identity has to struggle with this idea of successes and failures, right? The other way is death, right? Again, Mike talked about 9/11. Sad day, for this nation, for all of us here. And I remember I was in college, and honestly, I thought it was a movie when I saw it on TV. I'm just like, and I just walked to class. But on my way to class, I'm seeing everybody crying. I'm like, what's going on? And I just got to the US like 2 months before that, actually. So it was kind of like a shocking reality for me. I'm like, oh, wow, like that could have been me. Because I actually flew in from JFK. But death is an impending reality we all have to face. It's not a fun one to think about, but it is coming, right? And if I were to ask all of you today, assuming you know for a fact you have only 1 week to live, I bet the way you would live that 1 week would be different. Might probably be different from how you live currently. It has a way of resetting priorities, right? Let me read to you a poem here on death that I just want to use to capture the reality of death and the importance of identity in facing that. So this is from James Shirley, and I believe the title of the poem is Death the Leveler. So he says, and I'll speak about the poem after that. He says, the glories of our blood and state are shadows, not substantial things. There is no armor against fate. Death
lays his icy hands on kings, scepter and crown must tumble down, and in the dust be equal made with the poor, crooked, scythe and spade. Let me read that again. The glories of our blood and state, meaning the things we achieve, they are shadows, not substantial things. There is no armor against fate, meaning there is no armor against death. It is coming. Death lays his icy hands on kings. Scepter and crown must tumble down, and in the dust be equal made with the poor, crooked, scythe and spade. What it basically means is, at the end of the day, we all face death, right? What I have, what people say about me, what I'm doing, it's not going to matter, right? And it's important to have an identity that can confront that, right? So what is the better way of defining ourselves? Like I said, when you look at those three ways in which we define ourselves commonly, in general terms, I am what I have or possess, I am what people say about me, and I am what I do. Right? When you, excuse me, when you look at that, what you find out is there is a certain laden restlessness, anxiety underneath all of that. It's a rat race. We all know it instinctively. We know it's not sustainable. We know at some point it doesn't make sense, right? We want more. This is why sometimes, no matter what your status is, when you spend a nice evening with your family, there is something more fulfilling there. When you go on a certain vacation and you're just resting, there's just a certain perspective you have. You know instinctively that there is more to this life. You know instinctively there is more to the rat race and the things I'm running after. And so for me, that more for me, my journey came, at least it's tied to a popular saying that I'm sure most of you know from St. Augustine, where he says, you, O Lord, have made us for yourself, and I'm paraphrasing. You, O Lord, have made us for yourself, and our hearts are always restless until they find their rest in you. And that for me was part of the key, I guess, statement of revelation I would hold on to in trying to define who I am. I believe the more we seek is found in God. I believe the more we can anchor our lives on is God. And when God becomes that underpinning, I think then we have an identity that transcends ourselves, that transcends circumstances, situations, that transcends successes and failures. Your value, and if I may say this to you, your value is not found in what you do. It's not. It's not found in who you are. It's not found in your family background. It's not found in your academic accomplishments, career accomplishments, what have you. It's not found in what people say about you. You know people are fickle. You know you are fickle, right? It's not found in what people say about you. And it's definitely not found in what you currently do. Thank you. Thank you again for the gift of your listening. Appreciate it.
We have some time for some questions. People ask us some Q&A time.
Please.
Hi, Tolu, thank you so much for sharing your story. I'd love to hear more about your current story and just kind of your experience working at Google and being a believer. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. Maybe I would tweak that to say, how do I live out my faith at work, right? For me, it's pretty much the same as how I would live out my faith anywhere else, in the sense that your motivations and what drives you is a little different. So yes, you are at work, right? And whatever we do, we want to do to the glory of the Lord, meaning you do it excellently to the best of your abilities. But for me, there's a different dimension because there is more to who we are than productivity and what we do. So a key part of that for me is in forming relationships and building relationships just with the people around me. So looking beyond, so as a program manager, right, I'm managing a bunch of projects, there are deadlines, like, we need to get this done, what's going on, what are the blockers, the risk, let's escalate if we need to. But part of the key thing for me when it comes to faith is understanding that people are a combination of their backgrounds and their experiences and what's going on in their lives. And in getting to know people, sometimes you can tap into that. And that for me gives a much richer experience at work. And the conversation can go either way. But it's important for me to care about people, not just that I'm trying to talk to them about faith or God, no, but actually caring about people, right? And getting to know them. And then usually that opens up different things. Thank you. Please.
Thank you for your comments. You were reflective, especially during those 5 months when you was doing a job.
Yes.
How do you look at it now when your hair is on fire, you're very busy, people in this room are very busy all the time? Where do you go to, or how can you get space to actually reflect in a significant way? Because clearly you're a deep thinker, which is awesome. How do you get to that state during the busy day, or do you carve out time? What happens there?
Absolutely. So I'm not a great time manager, but I'm working on that. But one of the significant practices that has helped me over time in reflecting actually started during that period, those 5 months that was just really tough. So 2 things I do to reflect. One is I like to journal. It's a good way for me to get my thoughts down, and I'll talk about when I do. But it's a great way for me to sort of give language to what's going on within my heart, right? And when I'm thinking about it, things can come up in my mind, but I usually just push it away. But when I write it down, then in a sense, there's almost like an accountability to it, and I'm sort of anchored to it, and I can go back to it. I can hide from it. But when do I reflect? So a couple practices that have helped me is taking walks. I tend to take a lot of walks, either during lunch if I don't have lunch with anyone, or just during the day at some point. I just take a walk. I just get out of work, and as I'm taking walks and just thinking about things, I get to be reminded that, first of all, work will always be there. It's not going anywhere. And it has a way of helping me set priorities. It also has a way of helping me look at myself. Like, how did I react in that meeting? Why did I go off on that person? You know, why was I pushing back against that idea? And then thinking about, okay, where is God in all of this? What does this mean for me? So part of the questions I ask myself when it comes to decision making or I'm reflecting is, and this is a great question to be asking, is who am I becoming in this process? What is this making me become? What does this look like for me? Like in 3 months and 6 months, if I continue down this path, what does this look like for me? So to go back to the question, it's just for me protecting those walks that I take during lunch. If I can't take it during lunch, when I get back home, I just get home, I drop all my stuff, and I just take a walk around the neighborhood. It also helps to de-stress. I didn't know that at the time. It was just something I was doing. So that for me is significant. And then I love to hike, which the Bay Area is fun for that. So usually on Saturday mornings, very early in the morning, I'm in Rancho San Antonio Preserve. I'm usually somewhere there, just hiking, 2-3 hours, somewhere there. And that helps me in reflecting a lot. Thank you. Any other questions? You like me to keep talking? I'll talk. There you go.
When you're around highly driven people, which I think you are, and they turn to their own abilities to justify themselves, and you say, oh, it's because of the Lord in me, don't they view that as a weakness? And how do you reach out to them when they measure their success strictly by what they've accomplished?
Yes, you're right. It is seen as a weakness, and sometimes it might affect you negatively when it comes to performance evaluation, right? Because part of the idea of performance evaluation is you have to sell yourself, and you have to sell yourself strongly about the things you did and how you accomplished it. And I'm not saying don't talk about what you accomplished, but you're right. It does. There's a clash there. What happens though is over time, as people get to know you, and as people get to see the settledness in you about situations, about whether something happens or not, or whether you achieve something or not, there is an interest in why are you like this? And what is the underpinning behind why you are like this? Because the truth is, no matter who we are and how successful we might be or how driven we might be, we've usually tasted the sting of defeat and failure in some area of our life. Whether it be in your career, whether it has to do with family, they're usually areas in which we haven't done as great. And so there's usually an interest when people see the way you handle things. But it takes time, right? It's usually over a period of time. You're right, people are generally dismissive of that, right? And it can have a negative effect. Like I said, sometimes on your career, because if you're talking to a VP or a director, that's how you present yourself, that could, in their mind, that could derail how they see you. But for me, the key thing, even if that happens, is trusting in the sovereignty of God and the sufficiency of God. In the sense of, this is what I believe, this is who I am. This is why I say you're swimming upstream. Like there's a current that is generally moving and you're deciding, no, I do not want to go that path, which is hard and I struggle with it, I would have to admit. And often enough, it's the reflections that help me see where I'm starting to grab things again. And it's by my strength and I want to do this and I have to do this in this timeline. And that's how I achieved it, by the sweat of my brow and my back, right? So it takes that reflection. So it's usually the seesaw struggle. And the hope is over time, we are becoming the right kind of person. Please.
Thank you for your time. We're really blessed by your talk. I have the opportunity to work with a lot of college students who struggle with a lot of the same challenges, and people who work with Generation Z. You mentioned a lot of great questions to ask yourself. Is there any other one or two vital questions for somebody who was just like you at that age?
I guess I would go back to the question of who am I becoming, right? And maybe also looking at who are the models of my life? Who are the people I want to become like? And not just looking at them from afar, but getting close and seeing what their struggles are, what their day-to-day activity looks like, what are some of the areas of their failure, how do they handle that? Because one of the things that deeply impacted me as well growing up was the idea of role models, right? And usually it was from afar, right? I saw people, just hard charging, achieving a lot of things, and I wanted to be like them. I'm like, I want to be like that person. But in growing up and getting closer to some of them, I saw that some of them were struggling with a lot of things I take for granted. And I'm like, how can you be this person and you struggle in this area? Right? And I began to see that a lot of this is who we are becoming. A lot of this sometimes is you have to make strategic decisions and then your tactical decisions go from it, right? So back to what Michael was saying about when you talk about your achievements at work, sometimes I have to make the strategic decision that it's fine if I don't get promoted in 3 years, in 5 years, it's okay. If other people are getting promoted, it's okay. Like, yeah, it stinks and you wrestle with it, but again, it brings out some of the underlying things in your heart to sort of wrestle with, right? And I find that more helpful in the long run. Sure.
So what was the, apart from this acknowledgement or understanding of who you are becoming, what was the keys to your really maturity and growth in your faith over those years from getting all these degrees, working through the Motorola's and the Apples, and here you are at Google? What was really happening from a faith development standpoint?
Great question. From a faith standpoint, I think I mentioned that my identity in faith too was based on excellence in a certain sense. Oh, I don't do these things. I don't drink. I don't womanize. I don't do stuff like that, right? And I memorized scripture and things of that nature, right? And I have to say, in a sense, I was quite judgmental. And so part of what brought about maturity was honestly just affliction and just painful realities of just almost like the undoing of myself. So the 5 months of not having a job was one. There was a particular company I worked at where my first year was just a complete hell, in a sense. Like, I just didn't even know what was going on. Like, it felt like I couldn't think, I couldn't get my arms around anything. Everything was so chaotic that I started questioning, I'm like, did I actually go to school? Like, what's going on? Like, these are things I should be able to do, right? So painful brushes with reality and affliction for me humbled me quite a lot and got me more to depend on God, right? For me, that became very instrumental in my growth. Now, where did I go to find answers? Community, right? It was community at church, and I'm part of a book club that F. Martin runs. Some of you might know him. That has been wonderful in my life. The church I attend, that Mike attends, Mercy Hill, very instrumental in my growth. And then also just friends. I cannot understate the value of my friends and what they mean to me. Not necessarily because they sit me down, they tell me, oh, let me tell you how to live your life, but from how they live their lives. From just seeing how they live their lives, the things they struggle with, how they put their faith in God, like the reliance on God, the reliance in Scripture. When I'm thinking of, okay, how do I do this thing? I need to set this plan and do this because I'm a program manager, that's how I think. And yet they step back and say, why don't we pray about it? I'm like, yeah, we should pray about it, actually. Right? So there is this real dependence on God for them. When I was at Motorola in Chicago, I used to attend Willow Creek Church. And I found out at the time that I was just quoting scriptures. Like, my life didn't resemble what was in the Bible. Like, I didn't really trust God. Like, yeah, I'll pray. But I had like my 3 other plans to get what I wanted to do. And so I came to a point where I'm like, I really want to grow. And what I did, again, you see how my identity was then, was I picked one of the fruits of the Spirit. I'm like, patience. I'm going to do patience for 6 months and I'm going to be patient. It was bad. Like, everything I did, I was so impatient. I'm like, yeah, this is not working. So I had to look at that in a different way, which is more relying on God, please.
So you talk about becoming, and you talk about identity. How do you answer the question, who am I?
How do I answer that question? Is that question, who am I? For me, to answer the question, who am I have to go back to identity. So I look at myself as, I am a beloved child of God. That's how I see it. And I choose those words carefully. Beloved, speaking of, there is nothing I need to gain or attain, which is generally how I operate. I want to prove something. A child reminds me that I am not the master of my faith, and I can rely on God. And obviously, God being the underpinning of that. So that is how I see myself, that I am a child of God, and that is who I want to continue to be in my journey.
And how then are the characteristics that are unique to you, that are of God, revealed to you?
How then?
If we say we're created in the image of God,
Yes.
then you have some particular characteristics that are unique to that Spirit of God.
Sure.
So how are those revealed to you? How do you identify them?
Yeah. So,
Identify them?
sure. So in terms of maybe looking at some of those talents or giftings, is that where you're getting at in terms of how do you identify some of those?
Your answer.
Okay, cool. A lot of it comes just through experience in the sense of, as I interact with people, friends, sometimes they comment on certain things within me that I might not even notice, that I might look at, and then that might be something I sort of pray about and look at more. Like, for example, Mike mentioned that I sometimes teach at church, and it wasn't something I knew I could do until the pastor of the church walked up to me and said, oh, I think you should do this. I'm like, no, I don't think so. He's like, I think you can speak. I'm like, no, I can't speak. Right? And so sometimes it comes through that. But in terms of how do I use that, so I talked about the aptitude for academics, intellectual prowess, all of that. I am learning to use that more and more as a steward. Learning to understand this isn't just something for me to, pride myself on and, walk over people and say, oh yeah, I work at Google, where do you work? Right? But in being very humble about it, in understanding that it's a gift given, right? And not just in seeing that in myself, but also understand that everyone has gifts and paying attention to those. And that actually becomes very useful at work in terms of learning to identify some of those gifts and strengths in people and trying to best position people to be successful. So,
If you had, if someone gave you enough money that all your material needs were covered, understand that this is not an offer.
sure.
Would you still go to work tomorrow? And if so, why? If not, why?
I would still go to work. I I would still go to work, yes. Now, I might not work for the next 30 years, but I would still go to work. Why would I go to work? Because again, work is, in a sense, almost like another mission field. It goes beyond just, getting promotions and whatnot. I think it would actually make me more focused on people if I had such wealth or whatnot. It would make me more focused on people. It would make me more interested and take out more time with people. Like all the things I've said here today, I don't perfectly practice though. It's still a struggle for me as well. So I think that would make me go to work. And then also I just believe in the value of work. Right? In what you're doing is actually blessing people's lives. Right? I remember using Google for the first time and I was stunned. Like the Google search, I'm like, oh wow, this is a world out here. Right? So there is value to work, and I believe there is meaning in work that we accomplish. So yes, I would go to work. Now eventually, I might decide to travel the world, but I would still go to work. Yes. Skip.
So you're clearly a self-driven person. You've accomplished much in your life, even though at a young age you identified as a Christian, as a child of God. You found this is a struggle for you all along. You mentioned that you have church friends and so on. Do I understand correctly that do you have people that help keep you accountable or mentor? Do you believe in mentoring and accountability, those sort of things?
Absolutely. My friends definitely keep me accountable. And it doesn't mean we sit down, we say, oh, let's talk about what's going on in your life. Sometimes we do that. But again, just in the normal conversations we have, right? There's accountability there where there's a depth there where we can then share just about anything going on. Like, I really want to get promoted, and I'm struggling with this. And then the question comes, why do you want to get promoted? And then we dig into that. And sometimes that shows more of my heart and what I'm after. So yes, a lot of accountability through friendships and mentorships as well. And a lot of it for me, very informal in terms of, again, you strike up that friendship and we just get to talk. And sometimes it's more formal where we, sit down at lunch and we talk about plans and what does the future look like. But I do believe in that, and I believe in finding that balance where the people that are influencing you. Remember, we talked about how we are always undergoing formation, so there's always influence with whoever you're engaged with. That I see in them also this balance of, yes, you're motivated and you're driven and you're accomplishing things, but there has to be a better reason behind that than just, I just want to accomplish this and I just want to be known as the best. Right? There has to be something beneath that, because then that's something I can learn from and sort of be more like, in a sense. So yes, absolutely, I would recommend those friendships, and this is what Connect is about, right? In terms of how we engage and hopefully form those friendships and exchange information and keep in touch. Please.
You grew up as a Christian in Nigeria.
Yes.
Now you're a Christian in the United States.
Yes.
What would you say is the biggest difference between the church in Nigeria versus the church in the United States?
Interesting. So growing up in Nigeria was young. I still like to think of myself as young, but growing up in Nigeria, I grew up in a nominal Christian home, like Christian mostly by name. And in Nigeria, a lot of it was just, I'm just checking the box, right? We go to church on Sundays, let's go, right? But what I would say though, looking back, and the church in Nigeria, I would probably split it into two camps, is that there is a church in a sense that a lot of times because of just affliction and suffering, there is an anchoring of faith that is much deeper than just words that are being said. Because in some parts of Nigeria, you do have religious persecution up in the north. And so there is becoming a Christian means more than just saying a prayer in that sense. And some of that filters downwards towards the south, which was where I grew up in. And in the state, and the other side of the church in Nigeria is obviously, it's just more of a checkbox. It's just a thing I'm doing. It's a lot of times it can feel like a community club. That's what I'm going to do. And I think you see similarities here as well in the US, where In some areas, faith is more based on God and stronger. In some other areas, it's just more of a nominal thing. And I think sometimes, I just think it's general. If you have more comfort, more success, there is a certain way of taking faith, and this is true for me as well, where, it's just one other thing to do. Like, I'm really just more reliant on myself, and the way the world works is I need to do X, Y, and Z and get to the end. And faith is kind of like a back burner. When I face issues, I'll go to God. Whereas as your faith deepens, God becomes the centerpiece of everything, whether you're doing great or not, whether things are going well or not. So for me, I would say in my life, it's been more of a maturation, where in Nigeria, I was more of the let's just go to church. And here, again, mainly because I came here by myself, and I was by myself, I just had to face certain things more. And so more reliance on God through those struggles. Thank you.
Wow, let's hear it first.
Thank you. Thank you.
Connect Silicon Valley. Conversations, faith, and life.